Welcome, Leslie. It's wonderful to have you here at the University of Missouri, and all of us at the Missouri Review. We've spent months with Splinters. I think we might have a PhD in Leslie Jamison.
I'm honored and terrified.
Yeah, well, no, it's a very good thing. So it's wonderful to have the opportunity to ask you a few, or maybe more than a few questions. So the first question I have, since this interview is aimed at students who are interested in writing and publishing, I want to begin with the advice that you offer to your students in Splinters. You tell them that nothing is tedious if you're asking the right questions, and you also talk about the exhilaration of revision. May you say a bit more about the writing practice that you encourage?
When I talk to my students, I often encounter from them a sense of shame and apprehension that I very much share around writing into their own lives. Like all of these questions, like, well, why is my life worth writing about? Why would anybody care about my life? Why is my life more important or more noteworthy or more interesting than anybody else's life? And my answer isn't your life is more interesting than anybody else's life. It's that every life has the materials for like the most absurd and profound investigations inside of it. So there's no hubris in writing into your own experience, and there's no inherent tedium even in the seemingly ordinary personal experience. It's just about getting in there and finding what's interesting. And so often for me, questions are the sort of means by which I try to leverage out what's interesting in my relationships, in my past, and my own experience. Questions are also one of the ways that I try to get myself past and encourage my students to get past what I call like the cocktail party version of a story, which is just my particular way of describing the shorthand anecdotal versions of our own experiences that I think we all have. Well, my dad was a distant workaholic, and so I always grew up feeling, kind of invisible in his eyes. Like even this kind of pop psychologizing way that we turn very complex aspects of ourselves and our past into kind of transferable little units. Like, here, I'm going to offer you this parcel of myself framed in these terms, and we get kind of used to them. They're like smooth stones that we hold in our pockets, and they get even more smooth every time we like pick them out and handle them. And so for me, what it means to actually write into one's own experience in a way that might get at more of the complexity and more of the layers like lurking underneath that cocktail party anecdotal version of the story is all about asking those questions that might get you past the simplified version. So, okay, yes, my father was a workaholic and sometimes felt distant, but like, what about that inconvenient memory of how he always used to make me milkshakes when I was sick? Inconvenient because it actually betrays this tenderness and this care and this kind of bodily intimacy. And so sometimes getting past the cocktail party version of the story is about allowing those disruptive truths or disruptive memories to be part of the frame too, even if they don't obey the kind of central thesis statement you might have about an experience, a person, a relationship, yourself. So it's all about kind of trusting what might be interesting in your own experience or anyone's, and about kind of pushing past those more familiar versions of the story, which I think are most oppressive when it comes to our own lives, because we're always in the business of like thinking about our lives and talking about our lives. And so it allows for the kind of encrusted barnacles of those old fossilized stories to kind of, we clank around with them, and then we have to like peel them off and see, oh, what's like messy and strange and actually unknown to me about my own experience.
So talk a little bit about ambition. You explained that success satisfied a hunger or alleviated a sense of emptiness. And then later, once you become a mother, you joke that you don't care about ambition, you care about baby carriers. Has motherhood rearranged your priorities, or being a working writer, does ambition just sort of sort itself out?
Yeah. So first of all, I think ambition is hard. Ambition was hard for me to write about because there was a kind of shame that I felt rising up whenever I confessed, how much I wanted a book to do well, or how much I wanted, all the time and space in the world to write. Like, these things felt either vain or overly hungry or selfish. But most of the time when I feel a kind of shame impulse rising up as I'm writing into something, I treat it like somebody's just said polo really loudly in a Marco Polo game. Like, I'm getting somewhere, I'm close to something. There's a kind of heat that I should keep following. So usually shame is an invitation to like explore something, follow it a little bit more to wherever it wants to take me. I should say, so the moment in the book that you're referencing is a wonderful place to start, I think, because I have this moment where, I'm sort of projecting all of these ambitious aspirations onto other people. And my editor is wondering how many copies the book is selling. But, really what I'm concerned with is like, is this airline going to let me keep the baby in the carrier during takeoff and landing or not? Because that's going to dictate how much the baby's going to be able to sleep for the next 2 hours. And it's true that I did care about those very banal questions of baby management that don't feel banal at all when you're inside of them. But the next line of the book is like, who was I fucking kidding? I cared about book sales too, So I was also aware of the fact that even as I felt a kind of on one layer of my consciousness, I felt like ambition was receding behind a certain set of maternal concerns. I was also aware that even that recession was me trying to follow subconsciously a certain kind of script where, once you become a mom, you don't care about those things over there. You care about your baby's sleep. And so I wanted to also kind of call out the part of me that even in a moment of the text is almost trying to posture as the mother for whom motherhood has displaced all other concerns, and it's really one of the rhetorical moves that shows up over and over again in this book, not intentionally, but I tried to preserve it sometimes when it showed up organically, which was me calling myself out in a moment of posturing or sort of carefully cultivated self-presentation. So, am I trying to seem like a certain kind of mother? Am I trying to seem like a certain kind of teacher? Let me kind of pull the rug out from underneath myself.
So another method that you use of calling yourself out, you have your best friend Kyle and your mother play important roles at key moments in the memoir. Kyle describes your friendship as exhausting because you're always in the midst of some sort of dramatic transformation. And your mother also resists sometimes indulging certain moments. So you've embedded the narrative with these people who give an alternative point of view. And I was trying to come up with a label for that type. I know they're not characters, but role that is played in memoir. But talk about the importance of doing that.
I think there's so many reasons that those moments feel crucial, moments where another figure in the text is either pushing back on some way that I'm framing my own experience or offering their own very different experience of a set of shared events. And I think those moments are crucial for so many reasons. First of all, in a memoir, part of the contract between reader and writer is you're getting an entirely subjective series of events from one single perspective. And I think that's part of the beauty of the genre. I don't think it's something the genre should be ashamed of. Like, I'm quite interested in a subjectivity relaying experience from an entirely subjective perspective, but I think it also can create a sense of claustrophobia where it becomes thrilling at certain moments to really see around that perspective, to get somebody else seeing things a different way. And so one of the first moments in the book that I think of where that happens is the character C, my ex-husband in the narrative, is there's a way that I've been talking about the first few weeks of my daughter's life, and I describe my mother and my daughter and myself as a kind of closed hydraulic system where my mom is bringing me water, I'm nursing my baby, all the nutrients and the love are sort of flowing around, and I allow it purposefully to get even like just a little bit overblown and sentimental so that the next line can really land, which is like my ex-husband saying, the three of you were like a closed world. I had no place in it. And I think there's something so important about not writing from the enlightened perspective that understands and tells the reader in this kind of distanced way, oh, looking back, I now understand that there was a kind of exclusionary energy radiating off of this like matrilineal power trio or whatever, but really dramatizing my own solipsistic, closed perspective and dramatizing somebody else in the text seeing what I could not see for myself, because then you also see the narrator being a little myopic, a little selfish, a little bit self-concerned, and all of those were dimensions of myself as a character, dimensions of motherhood that I really wanted to explore and dramatize with my mother and with Kyle, who offer me sort of alternate versions, or just kind of, they offer a little bit of the splash zone impact of certain aspects of my own like dramatic monologuing about myself. Like I like to think I'm not like an entirely insufferable person, but I wanted to put a little bit of that insufferable grist in there too. I wanted also to really represent that part of my own experience in which I have felt wisdom to be a communal activity. I do feel like my understanding of myself and my life is enriched by these other voices. It's like I have no concept of self-understanding that doesn't involve the wisdom of other people. So of course I wanted to have moments where you're not just being told my self-understanding comes from the kind of radiant vision of these other people in my life, but you see it playing out.
Right. And the timing is perfect. I mean, it builds and those moments come just right at the right time. I want to talk a little bit about literary self-invention. The writer Vivian Gornick speaks about the difference between the self on the page and the self in life. And Philip Lopate has that often taught essay, Turning Yourself into Character. Both authors help writers of memoir consider this idea of literary self-invention. So is there a difference between Leslie in life and Leslie on the page?
Yeah. So it's a fantastic question. I love the topic of literary self-construction because I feel like even embedded in that topic is an important piece of understanding about personal narrative, which can be so easily misunderstood as a kind of under-constructed or uncrafted art, that you're simply relaying what happened as if there were anything simple or unmediated about it. I mean, I think before this book, Splinters, I would have said that one of the biggest differences between myself on the page and myself in life just had to do with maybe the unremitting seriousness that myself on the page could have. And I say this not because I think I'm somehow so incredibly funny in real life, but just people would meet me and over again people would say, oh, you're like, you joke around more. You're sort of, you have a different way of being and speaking than I would have expected from how you emerge on the page. And I think part of that was that my writing would tend towards reflection. It would tend towards sort of corporeal, like my writing has always been really embodied. So there's always a lot of thinking, a lot of feeling, a lot of body, but there wasn't always a lot of that kind of levity or those smaller moments that of course comprise a self and a life. And Splinters is really the first book where I tried to bring some of my maybe slightly sharper edges to the page. I mean, that's maybe intuitively part of where the title came from, but a little bit more of my self-deprecating humor, a little bit more of my kind of the way I'm gravitationally drawn to sort of absurd details or the strangeness of life. And so I don't think I necessarily created, you never create a version of yourself on the page where distance is entirely collapsed, but I was aware of bringing some of the parts of myself that had felt absent from the page before, bringing it there, trying to bring it there, trying to build those parts of the self for the first time.
I've marked a lot of funny parts, but I didn't write them down.
Thank you for saying that.
So I'm sitting here as you're speaking, trying to recall the funny moments. There is the one when you're living next to the fire department and you have the candles and you have some line about an alert or something.
Alert for divorcee candle fires.
Yes.
Yeah, that they would have a special code.
Yeah.
And they very well might. It might be more than a joke, you know.
Well, so as a writer, you're known for being quite fearless in terms of what you share about your life. And I'm sure students ask, or maybe they don't, but maybe students ask for guidelines or for a sense of what might be off limits. So do you have any rules of the road, so to speak, for writing a memoir, what you put in, what you leave out?
Yeah, so a lot of how I approach that question is less about a set of kind of prefabricated or strict guidelines and is more about process. So one part of my process that's been in place in some form or another for more than a decade is that whenever I write from personal experience, I offer to share the manuscript with everybody who appears in it. I always frame it as a question, first of all, rather than assuming that anybody wants to, spend the time and expend the emotional, intellectual energy to engage with what I've written. But I like to offer the opportunity. So usually I say, look, I've written something, you appear in it, would you want to read it and share your reactions with me? And I would edit sort of from that conversation. And there are a number of things that offers and some other things that kind of obviously doesn't offer, right? It's not me saying, tell me what you want me to take out and I'll take it out. It's not me saying, whatever you remember differently, I'll change so that the text reflects your memory, not mine. But it is saying, look, if you want to read this and tell me what you think, like, I want to listen. And so I always commit to making that offer, engaging in those conversations, and then editing based on what I hear. And that process commitment is really how I think about limits when it comes to other people, is rather than sort of trying to assume I know what they would want or what they wouldn't want, just allowing them a voice in the process.
Are you surprised by what people object to or what they,
Yeah, often. And that in and of itself has been a really useful long-term lesson of this process, that over and over again I think, well, I know I know this part is going to bother them, or like they'll really like, they'll really like that flattering moment. And the lesson is like, I don't know what makes another person tick, even people I know very well. I don't know what tiny little tender places are going to feel like bruises that the text is unwittingly pushing on. And part of why I believe in this practice is because it kind of tries to see around the limits in my own vision and the limits in my own assumptions. And I'll say that engaging in this practice, I don't want to make myself seem saintly around it, because it's not actually that we always end up somewhere where everybody's happy and I have everybody's permission. But it is about kind of at least trying to engage in the conversations. And one of the things I've taken from it is like, I kind of bring that back to my life, that idea that I can't assume this conversation will bother somebody, but I also can't assume that it won't. And I certainly can't assume I'll know what somebody, if I'm asking somebody for a favor, I can't assume that they'll say no or that they'll say yes. It's kind of trying to withhold assumption as broadly and deeply as possible, has really been a kind of one of the humbling lessons of bringing text to people.
Well, we're bad predictive creatures. I mean, we really can't predict people's reactions a lot of times. Personally, my favorite image of you in the book is of you sitting alone in a booth at a truck stop, drinking coffee and eating French toast and writing through the night. It's sort of an Edward Hopper-esque image. But during this free and formative period, You talk about writing weird, offbeat stories, and you share your desire to get back to those nighttime hours when you scrape the edges of something secret and important. And I imagine many emerging authors are in the grip of something similar, and they don't realize how precious that time is and how they maybe shouldn't rush through that time. So we speak about that time and its value.
Yeah, thank you for conjuring even just hearing you conjure it. I want to be back in that truck stop diner at 2 a.m. with that French toast. Yeah, I in that passage I was writing about being young, being in my early 20s. I lived in Iowa City. I went to the iWriters workshop, and there was this truck stop about 40 miles outside of town, calls itself the largest truck stop in the world. Can't vouch for that. It is very large. But I would go there really late. I would listen to Nick Drake's Pink Moon on the ride. I was really in a kind of big feelings, big highways sort of mode. And I would go there, and I would often allow myself to compose in these fever dream like rushes where I didn't entirely understand even what I was making. And I think that's part of where that language comes from, even the syntax, like scraping the edges of something secret and important. I like that verb scraping. It felt right to me because so much of the time when I'm writing, I can't see the shape of the whole thing. I don't understand it in an aerial way, like I'm looking down at a map. It feels more like, oh, I'm fumbling towards something underwater. I'm scraping the edges of something, and I'm learning something about its texture and its curves maybe and what it feels like, but I don't have a complete understanding or holistic vision. And you're absolutely right that there is something really special about having a relationship to writing where it can feel kind of clandestine and experimental and reckless and like it's happening, on too much coffee in the middle of nowhere on a dark road, and you don't entirely know what you're doing, but you're trying something. But I would also say, the next beat of that is remembering also that story, one of the stories that I wrote in those sessions, those late night sessions, middle of the night sessions at the truck stop diner, I brought into workshop, and I had this feeling like, oh, maybe I'd just written like the next Dennis Johnson, like wild, weird, crazy story. And I just remember my very lovely, very generous, very intelligent workshop instructor who had big, like kind of Midwestern dad energy. He just shrugged and he said, yeah, I don't really know. I don't get it. I don't really know what's going on in this story. He was like, does anybody, it was kind of like the word, like it wasn't even like he was viciously opposed to it. He was just sort of bewildered and indifferent. And so it was also a humbling moment, like the thing that felt so wild and free and true in the truck stop diner, the script didn't play out exactly that I'd imagined, that everybody would then sort of anoint me a genius and we'd go from there. It played out a different way, which was then like I felt embarrassed and humiliated and a little like a failure in workshop because I had had such grand feelings about this piece of writing.
I want to talk a little bit about finding your voice and finding your genre. And I mean, have you found, is memoir what's most suited to your talents, or do you feel liberated to, write fiction whenever you choose, journalism? And then more importantly, do you think that there are expectations for a Leslie Jamison book? And do you feel like subverting what everyone wants or thinks it should be?
When I think about finding a voice, I also think about this quote I love from Flannery O'Connor. I used to have it actually taped, or like I had it on a sticker stuck to the keyboard of my laptop. As she said, nothing can be possessed but the struggle. And I think, to me, I don't know what it would feel like to find a voice, because my voice is always changing. It feels like an unstatic, dynamic creature where every project has a different form and structure. How I appear as a narrator in the works that do involve me as a narrator, I feel like I create myself a bit differently each time. I always want to be pursuing some kind of formal or structural endeavor that I've never quite attempted before. So for me, more than finding a voice and then staying with it, or finding a genre and then staying with it, the thing I most want to stay with is the process of reinvention. So I think, it's happened over and over again. My first book was a novel, and ultimately kind of allowing myself to start writing these essays instead of writing another novel felt itself like a willingness to kind of let go of who I thought I was or the work I thought I was going to do. And for a long time, writing essays felt like this kind of secret, I used to call it my mistress genre, because it was this side piece I had. And when I was supposed to be working on this big, ambitious, historical second novel, I had really internalized the logic that novels that bore any passing resemblance to your life were fundamentally, intrinsically less rigorous than something that ventriloquized itself very far away from you. But I think in the way that the essay sort of offered itself as an experiment, a place where I was freer to play, but then I started to be known for writing a certain kind of essay, right? A hybrid essay that was bringing together personal narrative, cultural criticism, sometimes reportage, research. And that the form of that essay was really exciting to me. It remains exciting to me. It will always be exciting to me, because to me it's a truthful representation of consciousness. Consciousness is always sort of bringing together personal experience and what we see and encounter and research and learn in the world beyond us. But that kind of essay, once I'd written enough of them, I started to feel suspicious of myself when I wrote them. I started to feel the grooves, the well-worn grooves of my own patterns. And that became stifling to me. And part of the impulse to write The Recovering, which I think of as a kind of a 450-page extended essay, but it's a book about addiction and recovery and creativity, that has my own story of addiction and recovery as a spine, but also looks at a number of other writers and artists who got sober or tried unsuccessfully to get sober, and how both of those experiences, addiction and sobriety, impacted their creativity. It's also a book that's engaged with the stories that America has told itself about addiction, who gets to be a victim, who gets to be a villain. And part of what was exciting to me about writing that book was that it was a completely different structural endeavor than anything I'd ever tried. I'd never tried to bring together a kind of chorus of voices on that scale or for that duration. But again, it was like the difference between that and what I'd done before was exciting, more than that sense of having found something and now I didn't have to figure it out anymore. And then with Splinters, it felt, again, like this particular story I wanted to tell in this way. And it was different from a lot of the work I'd done before, because it wasn't hybrid in those ways. It was, it lives in my experience, it lives in my body, it lives in my subjectivity. And I wanted to create that sense of immediacy. I was very drawn to these kind of splintered shards of prose, and that could sort of pivot between the many selves that live inside of a self. So past and present selves, the self who was a daughter, the self who was a mother, the self who was a teacher, the self who was a wife, the self who was an ex-wife, the self who was a lover. So I found the sort of form, I found the rhythm, I found the voice. And again, it wasn't what I'd done before. And so many of the questions when Splinters came out, I were very much about, well, why, in a way, why doesn't this book do what the other books did? Why doesn't this book tell us about the history of divorce in America, which is a fascinating history, and another book could have done that. There actually is a really tremendous book coming out next year that does. But again, it felt like, well, it's not because I somehow now think memoir is a better form than those forms. It's just that every story, every project, every set of questions, it kind of tells me how it wants to be spoken or expressed. And part of the energy for me is in finding a kind of a mode a force field, a set of cadences for each project that don't remind me of anything I've done before. So yeah, I have no plans to write another kind of wholly personal memoir, but not because I've given up on it, but because it was never the plan to kind of reside in any genre.
You quote from Susan Sontag's diary, "I'm only interested in people engaged in the project of self-transformation." Is this true of your interests, and has writing Splinters been an act of self-transformation?
Yeah, I found so much kind of, I don't know, I found a kind of permission and just deep resonance in that quote when I found it in Sontag's diaries. And it was part of a larger feeling of gratitude I had for her diaries in general when I read them. I've always loved her mind, but I think I've often wished in her work that her mind would direct its gaze towards a sort of broader variety of objects, and particularly feeling. And her diaries show you her mind kind of not just thinking about camp or the metaphors we use to describe illness and all the brilliant ways that she thinks about all the brilliant things she thinks about, but also show her kind of waiting by the phone for her distant lover to call. They show her, being sick of being a single mom. Like, they show her kind of being just like a human who's living in space-time and living through the small, mundane kind of thorns and hedges of experience that we all live through. And so I loved getting to see this kind of more terrestrial version and gossipy version of Sontag in the diaries. And when she said, I'm only interested in people who are engaged in a project of self-transformation, it felt liberating and true to me in the same way that it feels true to me that one might never find one's voice, or like Dashiell Hammett said, that if you find your voice, it's over, that the point is to be continually kind of unmaking and remaking the self. And like, yes, there was a consolation hearing that as I was, ending my marriage and trying to forge a kind of a new life and craft a new home with my daughter. I wanted to believe that this wasn't just failure. This wasn't just life having kind of broken down and stalled out, and that there was actually something meaningful in these really often sometimes painful junctures in which life is being kind of reassembled from the scraps of what was or what used to be. So there was an emotional resonance in it, but not the kind of hope it offered didn't seem to me to be a saccharine or an artificial or a sugar-coated hope. It reminded me of a man in a recovery meeting in a church basement in Iowa who I met once, who seemed quite sad. It wasn't really that everything had worked out exactly like he'd planned, even once he'd gotten sober, but he said, things don't always get better, but they always get different. And that I could trust. Like, it wasn't a bromide that the universe was trying to sell me on, it was the truth. And I think Sontag's exhortation to kind of be in a process of self-transformation, to be curious, interested in other people's processes of self-transformation, struck me as liberating in the same way. Maybe she and I disagree insofar as I don't know if there's anybody out there who's not involved in some process of self-transformation. I just think some people are more, have named it more explicitly to themselves than others, and maybe some people are more intentionally pursuing it than others, but I think everybody's changing whether they know it or not.
Okay, so cover.
Yeah.
It's collage, and there's a photo, a partial view of your face, a child on a diving board, city skyline, and another child. So talk about this cover. Are these your photographs? Did you design it? How did it come about?
Yeah, so we went through a few different covers for this book. And there was something I loved about all of them, actually. The very first cover was one that I really loved. It was they really wanted to use some kind of image of me on the cover. This was not something that I pushed for, but it was something that I ultimately consented to. And the first cover was kind of a photograph of me that had been crumpled up and then kind of re-smoothed out. And there was something really arresting about the image. Like, it looked like a kind of a beautiful memory that then had been given up on or something, right? The crumpled photograph, and then there was some attempt at salvage. And so I liked it, and I liked the emotional suggestion of it. But ultimately, to me, it gave a kind of, combined with the genre designation of memoir, it sort of suggested like a memoir more fully driven by trauma, like Escape from a Cult or something like that. And that was very much not how I wanted to sell the book. Like, there's going to be a sensational narrative of danger, pain, and liberation. It wasn't that kind of book. So we ended up moving in the direction of collage, which felt so appealing and promising to me for so many reasons. Some of them are, a lot of them have to do with just the craft of the book. To me, the book itself feels like a collage. Right. It's built of these small shards, splinters of prose. And so having a collage on the front felt like it was giving you this visual embodiment of what the rhythms of the prose might feel like. And then, on a kind of subterranean level, collage is also like a practice that me and my mom have had together for my whole life. And because, among other things, the book is so much a love letter to my mom and to everything she's given me, it felt right to have, even if it was never going to be explicit, it felt right to me to have this form that we'd shared like so prominently, part of like the physical home and object that the book became. And then the images themselves, they conjure some of the different threads of the book. So it's me as a child. I didn't want to have my daughter on the front, but it evokes the state of childhood. The child on the diving board is a sculpture from a sculpture park in Oslo that my daughter and I visited together. And so in that, there's a sense of the art rapture and the role that art plays in the book. And then the little purple kind of torn scrap of city skyline is a photograph that I took of the Gowanus Canal, which is this dirty, polluted, kind of toxic sewage dump creek that runs through Brooklyn that is just incredibly sacred to me. It's where my daughter and I went almost every day during quarantine. It was a way to go somewhere, anywhere that wasn't just our block. But there was something about its kind of corrupted, toxic beauty that I loved. I loved the kind of dirty oil sheens on the surface and the way they like looked like internal organs that were always like joining and uncoupling. And I loved my daughter's obsession with this one boat that would kind of move up and down the canal. So to me, it evokes the way that the city is very much a character in this book, but also the ways in which I was sort of surrendering to this city we lived in as a way of surviving and sort of finding beauty in things that I hadn't understood as beautiful.
Well, thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
That was wonderful.
Thank you, Chris.
Really, I really enjoyed it.
Your questions are so thoughtful and so attuned to like so many heartbeats in the book and so many of its threads. And so I loved all the places that your questions took us. So thank you.
Thank you.